South African universities are no longer serious academic institutions, but platforms teaching witchcraft and sangoma rituals in the name of academic subjects.
I believe there's an explanation for that, Willem. It's called diversity.
This is not me joking or exaggerating. These are public lectures funded by the state, held this year. Take a look at this invitation. At the University of the Free State, which invites students to a public lecture, quote, exploring the rich spiritual traditions of sangomas, lethulias, and certain ngangas, whatever that means.
The scholar in question is Professor Agnieszka Podoleka from the University of Warsaw in Poland, as well as the University of South Africa. She is currently the leading expert globally on Afrikaner esotericism, and I have used some of her work for my own research, both on Afrikaner esotericism and the occult and African traditional religion or indigenous beliefs in Southern Africa. Additionally, her lecture is about Inyanga or Isangoma, Nganga, as well as Lethuela, the terms you so dismally butcher, which are essentially different names for traditional healers depending on the context or tribe or region in Southern Africa you're talking about.
Respected universities have become ideological battlegrounds. Academic standards are becoming a joke, and witchcraft is taught as if on the same educational level as physics. This trend is the direct result of the ANC's transformation agenda, specifically its push to decolonize education. And while the idea of transformation might sound harmless to some, what's unfolding on campuses across South Africa is far from benign.
As a South African academic and postdoctoral researcher at a South African university, I can tell you that this is a gross misrepresentation, but let's unpack it. First and foremost, if your scientific epistemology is restricted to using physics as a barometer for what is considered science exclusively, then I believe that your scientific epistemology is vastly uneducated and reductionistic. In addition, I also fail to see how diversity and inclusion is somehow dangerous. Although perhaps if you are a white supremacist anti-intellectualist in the 21st century who prides his whole existential identity on white nationalism and the preservation of whiteness in South Africa, then perhaps diversity might be dangerous because that would mean that you are no longer superior. Damn, equality must seem like such oppression when you've been used to being superior all your life.
It all started with the so-called Science Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town. Remember when these fallists argued 8 years ago that Western science must be replaced by black magic and that Africans used to be able to control thunder and lightning before colonization? Let me refresh your memory a little bit.
So can I respond to your submissions, because I wanted to directly respond. I was actually thinking about this coming here because I thought that it was going to be one of the coming questions. How do we even start to decolonize science? Because science is true because it is science, and what can you do? And my response to that was, if I personally were committed to enforcing decolonization, science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa. So if you want practical solutions to how to decolonize science, we'd have to restart science from, an African perspective, from our perspective of how we've experienced science. For instance, I had a question for all the science people is, there's a place in KZN, in Mkabialingana, and they believe that through the magic, the black magic, you call it black magic, they call it witchcraft, others, that you are able to send a lightning to strike someone. So can you explain that scientifically? Because it is something that happens
So Africans being able to conjure lightning before colonizers arrived. That is what you got from that entire conversation. Are you just deliberately being obtuse, or are you just naturally daft? Albeit a tad poorly phrased, I could still get the gist of that lady's question, who essentially asked whether science can be decolonized as it has been used as an instrument of Western imperialism, and that is an incontrovertible fact. You don't need to be a scientist or an anthropologist or a sociologist to know that. Second of all, her second question builds on that by asking whether science is replaceable per se by introducing African epistemologies or African knowledge frameworks, traditional knowledge frameworks that are not necessarily scientific in these scientific terms. So instead of asking whether science should be replaced by these indigenous knowledge systems, asking how science can benefit from these scientific discourses or these epistemic departure points is, I believe, the gist of her question. Now, I do believe the lady's question went over your head, Willem, because that is why you got such a ridiculous assumption or summary from that entire conversation. But nevertheless, there is a method to her madness, and that is essentially because of the fact that there is quite recognizably an epistemic difference between how we as white people see the world and how African people see the world. And we need to recognize that because of the fact that we are a diverse people and learning from each other's perspectives can help us grow. In addition to supporting my point of view, I believe there's a scholar from the University of South Africa, Masilu Lepuru, I believe he's a legal scholar, who articulated this very nicely in his article on epistemic violence in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, Lepuru describes these sort of differentiation in our epistemological departure points as Eurocentric rationalism and mythos. Now, where the Eurocentric rationalism, he explains as essentially the Western concept of cold, rational and logical analyses, with the mythos being a more playful and symbolic understanding of the world around us, which is the African worldview, the latter. And these are vastly different ways of interpreting and seeing the ways. But in the African mindset, this is a rational worldview, and that is valid, and that ought to be considered when comparing epistemologies with one another. And that, when you read it in these lines and interpret it within these conceptualizations, that lady's question makes sense. Does it mean that Western science needs to be scrapped? No. Does it mean that African mythological worldviews are inferior? Also no. These two worldviews can complement each other and can learn from each other. And that is what we call, in good science, interdisciplinary research.
The Science Must Fall movement seemed to be a very successful one in its endeavor. What were once respectable institutions of higher learning in South Africa have now been thoroughly transformed into indoctrination centers promoting African witchcraft in public lectures and scholarly publications as well.
No, Willem, that is not indoctrination. That is diversity. But as Slavoj Žižek said, for a populist, the ultimate problem is never the system, but rather the intruder who corrupted it. Yet allow me to give you an example of indoctrination at a South African university. For example, Professor E.P. Groenewald, then a professor at the theology faculty at the University of Pretoria, who drafted a report in 1948 justifying apartheid under the guise that Afrikaner Calvinists, Christians, are a chosen nation, God's chosen nation, with a holy mission. An African tertiary institution teaching Africans about their African cultural and religious heritage is not indoctrination. That's empowerment. And that's something that you can't understand.
This is the direct result of the ANC's drive to decolonize South African universities as part of their transformation agenda. And in this video, we will outline how the ongoing destruction of South Africa's universities can not only be attributed to the incompetence of the ruling party, but also forms part of a calculated agenda to indoctrinate the country's youth. The struggle over education has always been one of the key battlegrounds between competing ideologies and worldviews. Back in the 16th century, as the Roman Catholic Church was trying to come to terms with the Reformation and the growing influence of Protestantism on the continent's youth, the Spanish priests who founded the order of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, famously uttered the phrase, "Give me a child for 7 years, and I will show you the man." With this, he conveyed the idea that the impressions left upon children through education from an early age have such a radical impact on their lives that it really shapes how they view the world and interpret the realities around them.
I find it very ironic, Willem, that you would cite such a liberal theologian whose entire theology of children revolved around the idea of cura personalis, which he considered was caring for the entirety of the individual, and whose entire order of Jesuits was committed to caring for the poor and social justice. In addition to, if I'm not mistaken, also contributing substantively to liberation theology, which eventually facilitated the end of apartheid. I also believe that Ignatius of Loyola said something quite profound along the lines of, if our church is not marked by caring for the poor, the oppressed, the hungry, we are guilty of heresy. He also said it is dangerous to make everybody go forward by the same road, and worse to measure others by oneself. Ite inflammate omnia.
Ever since the dawn of modernity, ideologies have battled over the minds of the youth, and the 20th century was no different. One of the main battlegrounds focused on by the Frankfurt School of Marxism, which has always been the prevalent form of Marxism in the West, has been the systematic infiltration and subversion of schools and universities.
Ah yes, the typical anti-intellectualist populism residing amongst the Afrikaner nationalists about the rooi gevaar ever since, I don't know, the Cold War happened, and has been used to discredit the academic and intellectual institutions since the dawn of the 60s. But there's a book that explains it much better than I do, written by historian Richard Hofstadter in 1964, who won a Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, titled Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. I believe it quite substantively explains the tangent that Willem Petzer is going on here.
History has shown that those who control the institutions of learning controls the minds of the youth, which in turn enables them to control the political narrative in the long run. In South Africa, things were no different. As the political tide was changing in the 90s, so was the country's education system, especially its public universities. Formerly Christian institutions of higher learning, such as the universities of Free State, Potchefstroom and Pretoria, were systematically being transformed into secularized and, more notably, Africanized institutions. One of the first steps taken by the former rector of the University of the Free State once he took charge back in 2011 was to secularize the university's Christian motto, which previously was, "In God is the light of wisdom," or "In Deo sapiente lux," a paraphrase of a passage from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion.
So let me get this right, Willem. You are essentially bashing the entire higher education system because, according to your view, it is corrupting the minds of youth via its Africanization and secularization. Really? I mean, haven't you realized, first of all, you are in Africa, therefore Africanization in a country tainted with a history of racial segregation is par for the course. If you don't like it, go to Europe. But I can guarantee you it's no better in Europe because of the fact that globally we recognize the importance of inclusivity and secularization. Education around the world, tertiary education specifically, has been secular in Europe for decades. So just because the tertiary education system in South Africa is not catering to your white supremacist Christian preferences, you are now salty and bashing the entire education system because they choose to be inclusive rather than catering to you as such. That, my friend, is entitlement. However, what I can't make sense of is the fact that you are throwing a hissy fit about South Africa's public universities secularizing and Africanizing with their diversity and their alleged Marxism and what have you not, when in fact it's not like you don't have institutions that cater to your Christian, Western, white supremacist needs. I mean, seriously. That is, after all, why Akademia and Solidariteit have been built by the Boere-only fans such as AfriForum and Solidariteit, where they have consistently used narratives like you have to milk their members with existential dread like the Great Replacement Theory, white genocide, kill the Boer, and let's not mention the Trump cards, no pun intended, like the ANC and EFF cards thrown into the mix in order to, compare and make the logically incoherent narrative of the swart gevaar and the rooi gevaar coalesce in some grand conspiracy theory threatening the entire existence of the white Afrikaner in South Africa. In simple terms, you literally built Christian quality educational private institutions because of the fact that you didn't want to share a classroom with a black student whom you automatically consider intellectually and academically inferior because they don't share your worldview and they don't share your religion necessarily. And now you want to have your cake and eat it by complaining that the traditional institutions you've left for your private institutions are not catering to your needs. Really?
A mere 4 years later, Jansen published his book entitled Leading for Change, Race, Intimacy and Leadership on Divided University Campuses, in which he described the Calvinist God as a violent sectarian God, a racist construction of the divine.
Now, I cannot verify or disprove what Jonathan Jansen said in his book. However, what I can say is that his argument and his sentiment is essentially being proven by you in consistently quoting from John Calvin's institutions. And I believe it was the very Jonathan Jansen that said that it was the very Calvinist theology of election that was the cornerstone of apartheid theology and the justification of white racial segregation. Not just in South Africa, but Eurocentrism and colonialism as a whole, due to the fact that the Calvin institutions literally says that certain people are chosen by God to go to heaven and certain people are not. So yes, that is a very racist construction of the divine, might I add.
But the revolution in South Africa's universities didn't stop here. Simply de-Christianizing and de-Westernizing the universities was only the first step. The agenda has always been the thorough decolonization and de-Westernization of the entire university system under the ANC. Before we look into that, if you find our work interesting, follow the steps on this banner below to join our WhatsApp group and receive free updates. Decolonization to the African mind means thoroughly stamping out any and all remnants of Western influence in our university system.
No, Willem. That is where you're wrong. Decoloniality does not mean eradicating everything that is Western. It means deconstructing the Western epistemologies that has resulted in the perpetual oppression of the indigenous knowledge systems, individuals, and marginalized figures in society. And that is among the things you have mentioned as your entire raison d'être, which means Calvinist Christian theology, racial supremacy, neo-Nazism, white supremacy, illiberalism, conservatism, you name it, all of these things that are codifying your entire persona are what is being removed from universities. Because of the fact, Willem, individuals like yourself have since apartheid not constructed an identity outside of your whiteness. Your entire white identity rests on the fact that you perceive yourself to be superior. If you are equal, that concept of superiority disappears. You are irrelevant. You are insignificant. And as a result, that gives you an existential crisis because that means your entire cultural framework, your entire raison d'être, your reason to exist, is now defunct and obsolete. The problem does not lie with African universities and with Africanization and inclusivity. The problem lies with individuals like yourself who refuse to be equal, who consistently and perpetually perceive yourself as oppressed simply because you are demanded to share your toys and you don't want to.
And as can be expected, academic quality and integrity have suffered as a result. Take, for instance, the former Faculty of Theology at the Free State University, which has now been transformed into a Faculty of Theology and Religion Studies to reflect its embrace of so-called religious diversity. This very faculty, which was once a place of sophisticated theological debate, now hosts seminars on African witchcraft as if that was an academic subject.
Yes, Willem, just like a BA General, African traditional religion is a de facto field. In fact, African traditional religion and African knowledge systems and epistemologies are a growing field globally. You can see this by the research of, for example, Professor Agnieszka Podoleka. You can see this with the philosophy of Professor Motsamai Molefe. These brilliant scholars, including, for example, the Azanian philosophers, which I do know is a term that you guys dread, are growing fields not just in South Africa, but globally. The non-African countries are hungry for African epistemologies, and you, my friend, are irrelevant. I applaud and praise my colleagues at the University of the Free State because they are doing the Lord's work.
Yes, that's right. In the spirit of decolonizing the faculty, the University of the Free State actually hosted a so-called Ancestors' Day celebration to highlight the so-called enduring power of ancestor worship, ritual and belief in maintaining African identity in May of this year. But it didn't stop there. A few weeks later, the same faculty hosted a public lecture on the contributions and powers of traditional African sangomas. I'm not kidding, on the 13th of May this year, the University of the Free State had a professor deliver a lecture on the so-called sacred traditions of sangomas, which it tellingly describes as spiritual figures who remain central to the community life despite the spread of Christianity in the region. Yes, you read that right. Despite Christianity, decolonization means opposing the Christian religion and its influence as a product of colonialism and the white man's threatening presence here in Africa.
Now, this is such a gross misrepresentation, Willem, and you know it. Either that or you haven't read an inch of Professor Podoleka's research, in which she veritably states in her abstract that these traditional healers have played significant roles even in Christian communities, instead of blatantly eradicating them as you presuppose. Second of all, it is incontrovertible historically, religiously and otherwise that Christianity spread in Africa as a result of imperialism and colonialism. Saying it snarkily won't make it less true than it is. And as they say in more colloquial terms, in the lingua franca of social media, being a dick won't make yours any bigger. So, chin up, Buttercup. It was definitely as a result of your prized religion that subjugated individuals under slavery, oppression, and centuries of segregation. And that is something you cannot get away from, no matter how hard you protest.
So what we have here is a formally respectable institution of higher learning now holding public lectures on African witchcraft. Interestingly, the professor in question is actually affiliated with UNISA and even wrote an academic article back in 2023 in which she calls for white South Africans to be trained as sangomas and laments that colonialism and apartheid made it impossible for whites to be educated to embrace sangoma practices.
Now, Willem, you are just blatantly lying to people now. It was stated there clear as day by Professor Podoleka that it was because of segregation and apartheid that white people could not affiliate themselves with the Isangoma practice. And this was not just applicable to white people, this was also applicable to black people because of the fact that apartheid government had a thing called the Witchcraft Suppression Act, which completely outlawed the practice of African traditional religion as an entirety, something which fell away after 1996. In addition, you just don't adopt the African traditional religion like, oh, one more morning you convert, now you're a sangoma. That's not how it works. There is something known as the calling, or as they call it, the ukutwasa, where a trainee essentially receives a calling from their ancestors. I know you don't believe in ancestors unless you worship De La Rey or Paul Creer, but essentially those are your ancestors. And these ancestors, for example, either manifest in a dream or you get some other revelation to call to become a sangoma. And that is when you embrace the calling and you essentially begin the path of training under a more experienced sangoma. A brilliant book to read about this is Black Bull by Zandile Nkunzi, called My Life as a Lesbian Sangoma.
I highlight this specific example of a scholar from UNISA because it is so telling. It tells a story of how the public universities in this country, once counted among the top universities of higher learning in the world, have been completely and thoroughly destroyed by the government's aggressive anti-colonialism agenda in higher education. What was once leading academic institutions have now been transformed into places where not only are absurdities, such as witchcraft, being taught, but students are also subjected to threats of violence. A short while ago, the infamous chant "Kill the Boer" echoed on the Potchefstroom campus of the Northwest University, with the university's management refraining from even condemning it, despite several calls from civil rights organizations to do so.
Now, why should a university condemn something that was ruled as not hate speech by one of the highest courts in South Africa, and essentially a form of political speech that is just offensive to the sensibilities of the conservative pill clutchers? In addition, nobody cares what these civil societies, and I mean by civil societies as AfriForum and Solidariteit, has to say about anything. After all, weren't it them that went to the United States as a bunch of delegates to go and whine about the oppression of whites and then started backpedaling as soon as Donald Trump started inviting the white people to the United States? Also, Politics Web is the propaganda mouthpiece for AfriForum and Solidarity, so I wouldn't take anything seriously written on there without siphoning it through an entire bag of salt.
The decolonization of our universities is directly affecting the quality of education they can offer. Between 2015 and 2025, the position of South Africa's top university on the Times Higher Education World University Ranking List, the University of Cape Town, the University of Science Must Fall, dropped from 124th to 155th in the world. Likewise, Wits University, the second highest ranking South African university, in 2015 dropped from its position just outside the world's top 200 at the time to number 251 according to the latest rankings. And of course, having set our public universities firmly on the path of destruction, the government is now also coming for our schools via the exact same agenda with oppressive pieces of legislation such as the Bella Act. The fact of the matter is that it is not merely a matter of incompetence that has led to the dire state of our universities. It has been a calculated move by the ANC elites who attempted to win over this country's youth for their anti-Christian and anti-Western agenda. Everything this government touches gets destroyed, either through sheer incompetence or, as the case of our public university shows, through calculated agendas which, under the guise of so-called transformation, is now in the process of not only subverting but completely destroying this country's institutions of higher learning. If nothing changes, South Africa will face a twofold crisis: an academic collapse and a cultural implosion. As universities sink further, international students leave. Local students will graduate with less competitive degrees, and the brain drain will accelerate, and trust in academic institutions erode permanently. But perhaps even more dangerous is what's happening to our national identity. The systematic vilification of Christianity, Western heritage, and academic rigor, replaced by political propaganda and some ritualism, is reshaping how young South Africans see the world. This story ties directly into what I exposed yesterday, where we looked at the devastation caused by witchcraft in South Africa, leading to murders and cannibalism. Yes, cannibalism. If you think that is something of the past millennia, you don't really know what is going on in South Africa.